So again, welcome to our Northamptonshire Rights and Equality Council event on our reparations for the transatlantic slave trade realistic goal. We've got three amazing speakers for you. They are going to be presenting one after the other, and at the end of the session, at the end of the three speakers, we'll be opening things up for questions and answers. And just to say a little bit about our three speakers, we've got Roger McKenzie. He's a journalist from the Morning Star. He's the parliamentary reporter up there. He's a prominent trade unionist and General Secretary of the Liberation. We have Sharon De Leonardis, a prominent activist in the Black community, both locally, nationally, and regionally, and very focused on particularly contribution within the arts. And we're going to start off with our very own Donna Parmer-Smith, local Black community activist. She's been very active in the past in the Black History Association. She's been working in the public sector for quite a while, and a key figure in Northamptonshire in terms of community activism, and has written for us in the past, in about two years ago, an amazing blog which I definitely recommend you seeing. So we're going to start off the session with Donna Parmer-Smith. So Donna, please unmute and take it away.
Okay, thanks Anjona. Okay, I'd like to kick off with basically explaining that I had written an article. It was 2 years ago now. Gosh, it seems like a long time ago. And it was really a response to what was really happening out there with the Black Lives Matter movement, which had kind of revived, just seemed to go round again in history from the whole civil rights movement right through till today, and looking at how things have changed but still haven't changed enough. And basically I had signed a few petitions around reparations and compensation. I had signed a few petitions around reparation and compensation, and had noted that, you know, I'd done that before in the past. So it kind of led me to write a letter to my MP, which was Andrew Lewis at the time. I believe he's still practicing. So I wrote him a letter, and basically I was kind of really angry, I suppose, with the response that I got back. Basically, he just said that the government did not have the appetite for reparations, and the whole thing had been put to bed. And it was the kind of language that he used, which really reminded me of the whole colonialism kind of language, not having the appetite for it, and saying about what was currently going on, that they were focusing on COVID, etc. But what it led me to do was write an article all about what had happened, and really the reasons why I felt that reparations and compensation should be a good thing and should really happen. Compensation should be given around and reparations around three main points is what I was thinking. The first point being around slavery and the injustice of the whole human rights abuse of Black and African people at the time, the whole slavery, the whole issue of slavery being, you know, stolen from your country, sold into abuse and servitude. And the second, I'm just summarizing here, and the second was about the millions, the 20 million pounds, which works out to billions of pounds, something like 50 or 40 billion pounds in today's money, that was paid to the slave owners as compensation, which was first started paid out in the British government paid out in 1837 right through, and it was paying right through until 2015. In actual fact, they paid out the 20 million they borrowed from one of the major banks, which at the time I believe was Rothschild's bank. They borrowed that money, and then the government took money out of taxpayers' pockets to compensate for that, to pay back. So basically, I felt really angry that my parents had been paying. We've already paid with our blood, sweat, and tears as, you know, victims of our ancestors being victims and or survivors of you know, the whole slave trade, and yet we were paying through our taxes, paying again, which seemed absolutely unfair, and really made me feel kind of really angry and sick about the whole thing when I realized that we were paying through our taxes. And you know, the fact that I was paying, and I feel that we should have a tax rebate around that. And then the whole Windrush scandal that happened again in 2018, and that was revealed, how they had the government with their immigration policy had put in a draconian you know, whole policy around the Windrush generation. It was a hostile environment policy towards immigration, and that whole scandal had left people, had deported individuals who had lived their whole lives in the UK and had been disrupted and deported back, lost their livelihoods, couldn't work in the country, were treated like criminals and deported. And you know, the impact on that. So I felt that there were three main reasons why we should be compensated around that, around slavery. And just looking at, for me, one of the things that really upset me as well was the fact that the people that had benefited from the compensation the British government had paid out, I mean, they were all rich families who had, who were belonged to the 1%, who controlled things. You know, they were families that were involved in government, people that run our country. I mean, David Cameron's family. There's a whole host of individuals that that benefited from it. It was, I mean, looking at my notes, just trying to, because I did make some notes about that. There were various people that benefited from it. People like John Austin, David Cameron MP, Douglas Hogg, author Graham Greene, George Orwell, those families, poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning, various people of in high society, and the ruling classes basically all benefited from that, and the actual slaves themselves and our descendants, we had nothing from that. And then looking at what had happened in Haiti, back in 1825, when Haiti had been the first country to abolish slavery back then, and it wasn't recognized from the French because they were under French rule, from the French king at the time, and they made they agreed to recognize the freedom of the ex-slaves if they would pay them so many billions in compensation. So the Haitian government again was strapped, that country was strapped for cash for about 125 years or so, paying back the French government, and again borrowed from another Rothschild French bank, again, you know, keeping it within the ruling classes. But there is like legal instruments that can be, and legal action that can be taken through the United Nations human rights instrument. There is a principle and guidance on the rights to remedy reparations for victims of gross violations in international human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian laws. So I think that reparations can be sought under that law through the Human Rights Act, and we can look at reparations on a serious note, and reparation being the healing of what has happened to us as a whole generation, the descendants of the slave trade. I mean, just looking at history and the racism and the legacies that that slavery, the whole justification of slavery has left, and the impact it's had on society. Society still rich from the robbery, which was all part of the Atlantic slave trade, with the rape of Africa and all its resources, and the stealing of that needs to be all compensated back. So reparations need to look at a healing of people, because the whole slavery was a form of abuse. And as I said in my essay or article, you know, any good psychologist will tell you that, you know, to deal with abuse and to deal with, you know, that kind of healing, you need to have closure. And there hasn't, throughout history, there has been no closure. I mean, Tony Blair eventually, in 2007, eventually did say sorry, but even so, that is not enough. It needs to be it really needs to be ingrained in the public. There needs to be a reteaching of Black history or human history, because it's not really Black history, it is hidden history. It's the hidden history of Britain's atrocity and Europe's atrocities, which needs to be addressed in that way. And I think the compensation side, we really need to, I do believe there should be compensation. I mean, other people, there's been, the British government have paid compensation, and other European nations have paid compensation to the slave owners from Denmark, Paraguay, Brazil, various European nations that all took part in slavery, have got a similar legacy as Britain has, with paying compensation to the slave owners, but not to the people who were the actual the ex-slaves once they were free. So I think that needs to happen. We need to at least get it back in taxes, because I mean, it is a form of abuse for us to be paying the slave owners, paying for our own abuse. And that's basically what's happened through our taxes, through the British government, up until 2015. So I do believe that reparations is a possibility, because if you just look at the history of everything, of any change, you know, from workers' rights to the whole abolition movement, it seemed an impossible task at the beginning, but through the sacrifice and strife of individuals, it has actually come to fruition. And that is because people have been passionate about things and haven't given up. And I think as long as we keep that up, that will come to pass, because it has done throughout history. I mean, the government, one of the things I will say that I didn't mention I don't think I mentioned in my essay, but Operation Legacy, which happened between the 1950s and 1970s, which was the British government covering up all its atrocities it had committed in its whole colonial past for various countries, which was burning and destruction of documents and papers, anything really, any evidence, getting rid of all the evidence. I often wondered why no slave ships were present when there's tea clippers and those sorts of things happening. Well, I mean, if they managed to do that through secrecy in the 50s and right through to the 70s, it doesn't, for me as well, I would guess that is probably what happened. There isn't any evidence, but I'd like to uncover some as well, of the whole cover up and the way that they tried to sweep under the carpet the atrocities of slavery. But we all know about some of the awful things that have happened because of people like Thomas Thistlethwaite, who had written a diary about all the atrocities that he I mean, he actually seemed to enjoy committing against his slaves and the cruel treatment that he you know, put them through. So things like that are still left of evidence. And there are lots of Equiano's diary and Mary Prince. There's all of these legacies that a lot of the slaves had written, which will, you know, help as towards as evidence for the atrocities that had been committed during slavery. And we know now about the you know, the fact that we were paying for our own abuse, the abuse of our ancestors. I mean, which, as I say in my you know, in the piece that I wrote, it made me feel quite physically sick to think that that is what we were doing through our taxes. My parents, who are now past, and many of us who you know, who have now passed or left the country, had been paying. It just seems absolutely ludicrous, and that's happened across the globe, I will say, because when you look at the other countries that have the other European nations and America, incidentally, who have paid compensation to the slave owners, who are the ruling classes, and they benefited from it. As I say, from the Netherlands, Sweden, Argentina, Paraguay, Venezuela, Brazil, Peru, Colombia, USA, and the UK. So, you know, that's basically, I think, that's some of the things that I wanted to say. And the other thing I think should also be part of the whole reparations is that we, as part of the whole dysphoria, have been scattered and across the world, and we should be able to trace our families, and we should have free DNA testing. That should be free to the descendants of slavery and the colonialism, because that fractured our whole past. So yeah, I think.
So Donna, that's just been amazing. And can we just give a little bit of love to Donna in terms of her amazing kind of contribution? Just an absolutely outstanding call for action, highlighting the issues not only in terms of race, but also in terms of class, and also this real, you know, the emotional kind of acknowledgement of what has happened over a period of hundreds of years, so, and the failure of any kind of closure. So again, lots of love for Donna. Thank you so much. We have our next speaker on now, and that is Sharon De Leonardis. She's again a regional national activist, particularly Black activist, particularly in the field of the arts, and with a number of projects that are going on at the moment, one in particular around commemoration of the transatlantic slave trade. So over to you, Sharon.
Yeah, so thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you to Donna. You really did bring a real kind of insight into why and how we should try and be getting for reparation. For me personally, looking at how the world is and business, I feel that we'll get so many excuses, and we'll continue to get all the excuses of why they won't pay it back at this stage. But actually, after listening to you, you're making me feel I need to connect with you afterwards, because we need to get to the point where history is told the full story for us to allow the education to continue, because that's where we're lacking. And when we've got international days for other events, but yet it is not widely recognised to be International Day that has been set aside since 2007 for the Atlantic slaves, I think that is one of the key things that we need to stop and highlight. As you said, we seem to be following a vicious circle. Every 50 years, there's a big assassination or murder that takes part, that highlights the inequality for the Black community across the world. Now, the difference was this time with George Floyd's murder was that we had social media. Social media wouldn't allow this conversation to go away. Social media allowed us to start looking and really start to think about how can we change things going forward. And as an organisation that was set up to actually show the difference and highlight the different cultural practices between different communities so that we can have a better understanding, allowing minority groups to be in the forefront within different towns and cities to showcase culture, people coming together. So this then set the platform for Spectaculars to use its platform and to work with others at a high level to try and create an event that could highlight the International Slavery Day awareness for the Atlantic slaves, so that we can keep the conversation going every year without having to wait for an atrocity, that will allow this for people to stop, remember, start to do their full research into both sides of history that's being told. We know that history shows one side the majority of time, which is the victors, which sometimes is not appropriate for everybody. We need to understand where the history was lost, what the history has been hidden, so that we can have a full sense of purpose to where we are, who we were, and where we need to go forward. So we're using the arts, between dance, music and arts, which is relatable to all cultures, to all nationalities. And it needs to be all nationalities that are telling that story. I don't want it to be one particular race that might switch off others. We need it to be a story that's told by everybody, because it's everybody's history. And that's what I think is important, that we're able to identify and show in the past, because history has been airbrushed so much. We've lost the good stories of people that did come together through all nationalities to try and stop slavery. So if we can find and uncover those stories and use those to show the unity in the community of the past, how we can potentially move forward. So within our... Sorry? So within our organisation, we have got some international choreographers that are set to work with us, with professional dancers and musicians, that there will be a full story and show with digital images showing others that were there before us. What we're doing as an organisation is nothing new. It's things that Malcolm X, Martin Luther King was talking about: unity, everybody coming together. And hopefully this will allow that to at least keep the conversation going, so we can then move on and start to look at telling the full story of history, look at the history that we're teaching in the UK and Europe, as opposed to very different in the Western world, so that we can learn from our mistakes. And therefore we might get to the stages where we can start to have purposeful dialogue, the hard conversations that need to be had. Because let's face it, those that are at the top that can make the real changes, those are the ears that we need to affect. Those are the ears that we need to change. But until we've got more people and we're challenging those boardrooms and committees that aren't reflective of the community, that don't have the demographic mix in those groups, we should be able to stop and challenge, so that when decisions are being made, that it's then with the empathy with the minority community groups. So I think there's a lot that we can do. But unfortunately, we're still in the stages that we still have to make some of it more palatable, because I've had conversations in the last 18 months where we've developed, how do we tackle this? How do we talk about this without some people wanting to switch off? When I've wanted to talk about slavery, I've spoken in a room or on Zoom and physically seen people lift and put their hands over their ears, that they don't want to hear it. But unfortunately, these are conversations that we need to have. But when we can talk about and bring it in a way where we're talking about, and I know Donna said it, about challenging class and culture and understanding class and culture, how that was imposed, then we can hopefully get to a better place of understanding. But for us, I think we're still so far away from when we will get a lot of those conversations, but it needs to be the point of where we have that reflection that everybody is switching onto this, from schools, colleges, businesses, that we are focused not just on the Black History Month, to look at the day that we honour, and we really look and see the slaves that came before us, that had their lives torn apart, ripped apart, families ripped apart, and that so many people are benefiting from those atrocities. And it's making sure that when we're doing this, we're actually challenging and asking individuals, asking schools, asking colleges, asking businesses where local areas benefited. Because once we start to raise that awareness and then hopefully start to prick consciences for people to come back and to say, well, what can we do now to actually change, to actually move forward? But I think it needs to be driven by the people to make sure that that is honoured, and then we can start looking to see other ways that we can get the full story of history, which, as you said, is everybody's history, 12 months of the year, not just the 4 weeks. And then we might just be able to start talking about how can we have reparations? How would that look like? Where does it go? What does it get invested into? Because there's so many things that we could be doing, but we need to have a long-term concentrated plan of how that's done. And Donna did speak about the education of healing, the trauma, and how can we support the next generations coming up to learn the full story.
So absolutely amazing, Sharon. Thank you so much for that. And can we have a little bit of love for Sharon, please? Kind of really emphasizing the need for this full sense of purpose, the need for this acknowledgement of everyone's history, the acknowledgement of the whole emotional kind of the emotional kind of reparation that needs to happen for there to be closure. And thank you so much, Sharon, for that. So we've got our last speaker coming up at the moment, and that is Roger McKenzie. Again, Roger is a prominent national journalist. He is the parliamentary reporter for the Morning Star. He's also a long-standing prominent trade unionist, and also currently General Secretary of Liberation. So Roger has both written and spoken on this issue extensively, and we're really privileged to have him speaking tonight. So thanks, Roger.
Thank you, and Jonah, the privilege is mine, I assure you, and thank you and your colleagues for organising what I think is a really, really important meeting, and thanks for everybody for coming along this evening too. First point I'd like to make is that my ancestors were not slaves. They were people who were enslaved. And I think it's a really important distinction to make. These were people who were ripped away from their homes. So that's my starting point. The second thing that I'd like to say is that the question that we're asked to look at tonight is whether or not reparations because of the transatlantic slave trade is realistic. I don't think it goes far enough, actually, just to talk about reparations for the transatlantic slave trade. I think we have to be talking about reparations because of colonialism too, and because I think that that has been very instructive about the way that what this is really all about, frankly. Slavery and colonialism were political projects, and I think it's really important that we don't just look at this as some kind of moral question about paying back something. There's morals involved, of course. The problem with talking about morals is that we're talking about a whole bunch of people who have demonstrated time and time again for hundreds of years that they have no morals. The only morals that they have is for profit. That's the only thing that they're interested in. Enslavement was about profit. The colonialism project was about profit. And so therefore, if it's a political project, I think we have to look at this whole thing in a political way. We have to look at this thing in a way that is looking at the political dynamic around all of this. I think the two excellent contributions that we've just heard, Sharon and Donna, have really underlined some important things. And one of the important things that they've both talked about is the reaction of people when you start to raise issues of reparations. Actually, it's the same attitude that we get when you start to raise issues about challenging racism in the workplace or in the community. People get all, well, maybe if we just don't talk about it, it'll somehow go away. And of course, that's nonsense. And we also get people saying things like, well, all we have to do is say sorry. Well, I am sure that there are lots of people on this call who have heard people or seen people or been on the end of experiences where people who've been racist in whatever way think that all that is needed is for them to say sorry. I remember one time I was a school governor at one particular school, and we were talking about a policy around racial harassment. And I was told that part of the policy should be an apology from the person who was being racist, and then that had to be accepted by people, and that should be the end of it. But I'm just like, no. I had a massive row with people about that, because I've seen too often where people can be racist in 1 minute, apologize, and just say, well, it was only a joke, so I'm sorry about that. And actually, the hurt is there for sure, as Donna and Sharon have both indicated. The hurt is there, but actually, it's not enough. And the reason why I'm saying that, and I'm certainly not going to repeat the excellent points that have been made by the two previous speakers, but it seems to me that the reason I want to add colonialism into this conversation is because, frankly, when somebody comes into your home, kicks off their shoes, orders you around, and decides that they're going to take over your home and take out all of your goods and valuables out of that home and leave whenever they feel like it, or you have to fight to make them leave. I think it's not good enough just to say that they can just leave and the hurt has gone and that you're not damaged physically, mentally, and by the goods that have been taken away from you, the resources that you've created. Because part of the profit motive, part of the reason behind the transatlantic slave trade, in fact, the main reason behind the transatlantic slave trade, of which racism was used as a justification. And and again, the main reason for me around why colonialism is about this profit motive. And we have to understand that money is at the root of this, and that they never give up their money without us having to fight for anything. And one of the reasons I say that they have no morals is frankly, we're in a situation at the minute where people are struggling to put bread on the table and keep a roof over their heads. And we're in inflation's going to hit 18% next year. People are struggling to survive. The energy cap's going to be raised to something ridiculous. So people really cannot afford to put the heating on this winter. And the powers that be, politicians, have no sense of the urgency around making sure that people can heat and eat. So for me, that tells me that they have no morals. They're not bothered about what is happening as long as they can make their money. Because what I see, and I see it every day in our newspaper, I see our people I see working class people getting poorer, and I see the rich getting richer, and I see our people, I see Black people, I see people of African descent and people of Asian descent at the bottom of that pile. And they'll always point to the odd individual who's managed to make it to the front bench of the Conservative Party or something. They'll always be able to point to those people. But look around this country and you will see where we all are. And if there wasn't a strong enough argument before you looked at where we were in society, then that should be able to tell you, because I don't see things getting that much better for us. I still see masses of racism across this country. I still see Black people struggling to get into jobs, and when we get into jobs, we can't get promoted, and within those jobs we can't get access to training. I still see us getting a lack of access to the resources that are going to help to improve our lives. So all of these things are vital in terms of the reparations conversation. What should that reparations look like? I don't know, but I'm prepared to have the conversation with people about it. And some of the points that have been made by Donna and Sharon earlier, I think are really important around education, around DNA testing. I think is a really, really good idea, so that we can look back and find out where we come from. I have looked at part of my DNA, and I found out that on my mother's side, I'm from the Tikar community, which is now in the what's known as the Cameroon. But I don't know my people there. I could go there tomorrow and walk past somebody in the street and they could be my family and I would never know about it. So they need to be as imaginative as we are. But one of the things I've learned as a trade unionist is that we can make a demand, but we also expect the person on the other end and to come up with their own solutions as well, with their own ideas about what can be done. But please, we have to say to them, don't come up with this idea. Don't come back to us with this nonsense. Well, we gave you all these things when we colonized you. We gave you railways. We gave you education, and we gave you, civilization, which is the one they always tell us, because apparently we had no civilization before they turned up. Absolute rubbish and nonsense, right? They tell us all of these things. Let's remind them of the rich history that they stole from us, the rich history that we had before they decided to come into our lands and to drag our ancestors out and to enslave them on plantations in the Caribbean, in North America, and in Brazil and other parts of South America as well. We have a rich history, and we have to be determined to make sure that they pay for what they stole from us. But we don't get those things without organising and campaigning for it. So we have to stand up and we have to straighten our backs and lift our heads and be proud of who we are and go out and organise and campaign for reparations, because without that campaign, everything indicates they will not simply just give that to us. They simply will not give reparations to us without us getting up and organising a movement that's going to win it from them. Thanks very much for listening.
Okay, again, another amazing contribution from Roger. Can we show him a bit of love, please? Because just focusing on speaking truth to power, speaking about the lived experience of others and being creative about our solutions to this issue, and organising and campaigning so that we can actually get to a situation where reparations are a realistic goal. So with that, I'm going to kind of open it up to if anybody.
There was a question that was put in there, I think let me just check. I think it was Roberta, sorry. Roberta was saying about that she disagreed with making it palatable. And I get where you're coming from, Roberta, but because of my background and past as in working in business and the arts, we've got to look at it that some people won't listen. you can put the same message, but it doesn't get through to them. So I like to think about being adaptable to say, okay, if I need to change that terminology to actually get that person to the point where I need them to think and understand, then I will. And then once they do, then I can turn it back into the harder message that they need to hear. Because I think for me, I'd like to try and switch more people on if I can. But I understand where we're coming from. We shouldn't have to make it palatable. But I've got a parent that will tell me, sometimes they don't know any better. So you need to be able to teach it and say it in a way that they will understand. But I get where Roberta was coming from.
Okay, and Roger, you wanted to come in on that?
Yeah, because I think that's a really, really good question, Roberta, and I do get what you're saying, Sharon, on this, but I kind of tend towards what Roberta's saying around this, I have to say, because what we hear all the time is about how we have to make the experience that our ancestors went through somehow palatable, when it wasn't particularly palatable what people were experiencing. And I just think we have to, one of the things, I mean, I'm also a historian, and one of the things that I hate about some of the trends around history at the minute is the way that people are trying to dumb down history. And I think we have to tell the truth. And I'm sure that nobody, and I'm sure Sharon's not saying this either, but we have to find ways of being able to get people into the conversation. I understand that, but we also have to say, this is the reality of what our people faced. This is the actual reality of it. And I think, therefore, that is a really upfront, in your face sometimes kind of thing to say, because people don't want to hear those things sometimes.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you. Donna, I didn't know whether you wanted to come in on that.
Yeah, sorry about that. I just had some technical difficulties. I don't know what happened there. Yeah, I mean, I agree on the fact that history has to, the truth has to come out, and it's a way of putting it across. We have to find a way of putting it across that it becomes the norm, because at the moment it all seems to be sanitized into a way to make the colonizers look good still. It's done in such a way that it still looks at the black nations still as inferior. It still puts that those are the messages that still come across, that the Europeans, we did all this, and the fact that they let us have our freedom because they had, that they suddenly got a conscience. It's not about the fact that it was everything that they've given, from civil rights to freedom, has been fought for, has been a long struggle. They tend not to focus on that. And what has to happen now is that we still use terms like Black history and that, and it has to be it's everybody's history. I mean, the word history, his story, that's what it is. It's his story. It has to be our story. It has to be everybody's story. And it just has to be so inclusive, but it has to tell the story in the truth. And the truth has got to be there, because the truth will hurt, and it will feel, because it's Britain's shameful past.
Absolutely, but I like what you said, it's the full story. So FULL, we need the full story of history. And as you've just said there, Donna, how I'll use it within cultural events is to showcase who we were, who we are. So the founders, the inventors, I want that story to come across, that positivity. So once they start and stopping and really understanding for others to see, then the hard history, the truth, as Roger was saying, can really come through and be told. Because too many people think, oh, actually, these were people that weren't doing anything, that they were nothing. And yet we know where we came from. But yet, because of history, the wrong history, that's not going. So the way that we do it is the full empowerment of our strength, who we are, who we were, and who we will continue. Because let's face it, the fact of where we are now and that we have come through everything shows strength, the resilience, and that's powerful. And for more people to understand and move forward with that, with a sense of, as Roger's saying, let's get organised.
The other thing that has to happen with that, I think, is that we have to undo all the terrible legacy, the science, the false science. Basically, the European scientists back in the 1700s, right through, you know, to the 1800s, and then right through to the 1900s, they were still asking whether Aboriginals were humans. I mean, there were people like Buchenbach and Carlyle and all these people. I mean, they had the whole paper and taxonomies about different races and cultures, you know, split people into races, and they had the so-called Negroes, our descendants, right at the bottom and whites right at the top, and in between a graduation of colour right down to the black man. And that still lives on today, and people still believe that. I mean, people still believe that black people can't swim because our bones are heavy, all kinds of nonsense like that. So, you know, all of these things, these myths, and they need to be blown away with facts, and the fact that we are not, you know, we inventions and architecture and all these sorts of things that we were involved in, you know, from people are shocked when they hear about people like Benjamin Banneker building the White House. You know, he was the architect because they couldn't afford, the other one died or something, so they couldn't find one quick enough, so they got a slave or a freed slave to do it at the time. And, you know, he had the skills and the knowledge, you know, all of these things. There is so much. I mean, you know, we've got people like Mary Seacole now in the throes, but she's still, people don't know who she is still, you know, a lot of Europeans don't. But yeah, we need to change history. That needs to be part of the reparations. There needs to be a whole education. It needs to change. They need to rewrite history to look at it from different points of views as well.
Can I jump back in again? Because one of the things about this that I just think, because I think that's dead right, Donna, because one of the things that we face at this moment, and we've seen this really escalating recently, is a whole thing about they call it anti-wokeness.
Oh, yes, yes.
And it's really important that everybody on this call understands what's going on with that, because it's basically saying we cannot talk about these issues. If you talk about anything, you know, critical race theory is another thing, right? If you talk about any of these issues about race, never mind slavery, never mind reparations, if you talk about any of these things, then you're just being woke, you're just being some, you know, super liberal type, you know, somebody who wants to cause grief. I do want to cause grief, actually. That is what I do for a living. I absolutely do want to cause insurrection against these people, right? Because they are saying, by using terms like anti-wokeness, they are saying you have no right to be able to stand up for yourself. You have no right to be able to argue that racism was wrong, that enslavement of our people was wrong, and something needs to still be done about those things. That's where this whole debate is going now. And I think, you know, that's what I'm talking about in terms of building the movement. You know, we can't have just you know, it's not just ever going to be a movement about just reparations for the transatlantic slave trade, or a movement about anti-colonialism. It's going to be a movement that is going to say anything that's progressive is out the window. We have the most authoritarian government in living memory, frankly, and they are going to get worse with this. And we're going to have to stand up for these principles.
Well, we have to. So Roger, if I can just cut across you, just because we've got two people wanting to contribute from the floor, if that's okay. So we first have Lucy Scott. Lucy, do you want to unmute and kind of give your contribution. Also, recommend to people, please look at the chat. There's some incredible kind of contributions coming in from there. That's great. So Lucy, you've got the floor.
Hi, thanks. Hi, Anjona. We have spoken on the phone, and there are some people in here I know, and some people that I've seen and listened to many times. So, like, it is a privilege to be in this space, remembering what today is about. I have been kind of multitasking a bit, and kind of like being in between this and the Global African Congress. But the fact that we're talking about reparations the way we are today, I think is a really great thing. And like the energy is just really like been really inspiring, because, you know, like when people do talk about, you know, our struggle in a negative way, it's like our history is amazing, our resilience is outstanding, and we've always been fighting. So, you know, it is for us to be picking up the baton from people like Roy Hackett, you know, and fighting. Like, there's different ways of fighting. So for me, you know, I'm fighting within the Labour Party, in the classroom. Like, we're really trying to push through the NEU around like changing the curriculum. Some people don't like decolonisation as a term. Some people talk about black in the British curriculum, but at the end of the day, you know, we know about exclusions and off-rolling and school to prison pipeline, and there's so much to do, you know. So like, even in the other meeting, what the guy from ADPAC was saying about us being organized, and, you know, like having like what I would say is that as we are organized, we have to have people that we mandate to go out and push, you know, whichever avenues are available to us. But, you know, in relation to what someone was just saying about unraveling and dismantling a lot of this ingrained, you know, inferiority stuff. Like when I was in Belgium in 2018 in the European Museum, they still had Black people's heads in boxes. Like, it was just utterly disgusting. But even Belgium's talking about reparations. So I think it is about the 50-year kind of generation. You know, it takes that time to build a generation, but also it is about a century and centuries. So, you know, we've had 50 years, but we've also had 100 years, like, you know, Marcus and Hubert Harrison and J.A. Rogers, like, you know, Tulsa was around this time. Like, we're still going forward. So, you know, in relation to like the social media, it is important that we're educating people so that they realize how much of this is a class war. Because fundamentally, when the king got put back on the throne in the 1640s, enslavement of Africans went through the roof. This capitalist system, the oppression of, you know, working class people, it all happened. We were fighting together. Mary was fighting with those fighting for the Factory Act. So, you know, like right now, like we have to be mobilized because they are coming for our human rights, and we do have to dismantle the discourse around being woke, because, you know, that is basically the denial of us getting what we're due.
So thank you for that, you, Lucy. I want to just bring in Indigo, because he's also said that he wanted to come in. Indigo, do you want to, and then I can.
Hi. I'm a female.
Sorry, Indigo, sorry,
that's
apologies.
Fine. That's fine. I just wanted to say basically that the importance of this kind of platform, because you know, I'm a Black individual, I'm middle-aged now, and, you know, throughout my life, growing up in the 70s, having white friends, and then all of a sudden they're turning around and shouting out NF and nigger this and all the rest of it. You know, that was very difficult to understand as a very young child. And obviously I've always appreciated my Blackness. I wear dreadlocks. You know, I try my best to be involved in platforms like these. But what I wanted to say was, for me, some people have already said it, it's about education. I used to be a youth worker, but unfortunately, when you work for the local authority, there's only so much you're allowed to actually put out there, you know, because we're not supposed to be telling the truth. You know, when I was at school, I didn't know nothing about the slave triangle. The only thing I knew back in the 70s, 80s was about Roots, the film. I knew it was disturbing to watch. And when I grew up, I knew about the record called The Crown by Bird, I forget his full name. And that I could relate to. But my thing that I'm trying to say is, I didn't learn about the slave triangle until I was 21, when I was doing a BTEC course, and about eugenics until I was 30, when I was doing a youth work training course. And to me, when I was at school, I was learning about things like the Saxons, you know, all of that kind of history, and I couldn't relate to that. As a Black child, I've since realised that I have neurodivergency, so being dyslexic and autistic made it very difficult for me to engage anyway. It wasn't interesting for me. So as a youth worker and someone who's worked with young people, I've realised that when we're engaging with young people, we need to come at where they're at and make sure that they understand that they are beautiful and they don't need to be listening to when people are saying they're not. Because when I was doing a placement in a school, there was two 9-year-olds who were both African girls, and they denied that they were African. And I was like, well, why are you saying you're not African? I know you're African. Oh, because we get teased by the white boys. We get teased by the white boys. And in the 3 weeks I was there on my college placement, they actually had a change of mind, and they realized that being African was actually nice. And these were 9-year-old children back in 1990. You understand? Whereas I always grew up knowing that I appreciate my Blackness. You understand? And I just feel that so long as we've got platforms like this, and if say like there's 26 of us on here, each one of us takes back something from this and tells someone else is telling someone else, and someone else is telling someone else, and someone else is telling someone else. And collectively, we're coming together, because you're right, we do need recognition for the wrongs that have happened to us. But you know what? Like someone else has said before, there are a lot of people that choose not to listen. There are a lot of people that are going to choose not to listen. And, you know, I can't make people hear me, but I can give them the plate, and it's up to them what they want to do with that plate. If they want to eat from that plate, or if they decide, you know what, I want to throw that rubbish in the bin, because that's how they might consider it. But the other thing I wanted to say, I think language is a very good, language is like a weapon, because when people talk about, you know, the anti-woke business and stuff like that, I wrote on my piece of paper, race card. The amount of times that people will turn around and say, oh, there they go, bringing up the race card. And I'm looking and I'm like, well, where's the race card? Because I don't have no car beside me. I'm talking about something that matters to me. If you don't want to hear that, that's fine. But when you're telling me about how your boyfriend's beating you up and you want me to listen, you understand? So language for me is a very important thing. And the last thing I wanted to actually say is that we need to have more positive images of our Black leaders and inventors, because that's something I've discovered later in life. And also, I know this is going to sound a bit contradictory from what I just said, but when I was a youth worker, and we were talking to young people about being safe for that, the onus was on talking to girls about boys' behaviour. And I was like, well, no, we need to talk to the boys about their behaviour. They need to be responsible. So in a way, you know, you and I, we could be talking to people that are ready to listen, but there are people that aren't listening, that ain't going to get it. They need to somehow be, I don't know, we need to reach them somehow, I think is what I'm trying to say.
So thank you, Indigo, for that. I just wanted, I know Sean's got his hand up, but I just wanted to, we've had those two contributions. Roger and Donna, did you want to kind of respond to either of them?
Yeah, I just want to be brief, because I know that people are trying to get in. Yeah, I mean, into what Indigo was saying, and to what we were just talking about what Roger was saying about about wokeness as well, all of that. It's about the language. It is about the language. It's about the language that we use, and trying to change people's hearts and minds. Because one of the things that with all this, you know, anti-woke and all of that, it is about how we use the language, and it's about using the right psychology to address all of that. So we have to think carefully and tread very carefully. I've always said that if the government wanted, if they really wanted to change the hearts and minds of the nation against to be totally anti-racist, they could do it, because they changed it about things like drink driving, AIDS, you know, with these great films and that. So we can do it. We just have to think about it, think about it, and think about the language that we use, and to be able to think, you know, get proper and good filmmakers, art makers, to be able to do that and turn that around. So it's about the language that we use in order to address the anti-woke, in order to address that kind of anti-black, because they are afraid of what it might do. It's also about the psychology about it as well, and it's about how it affects people. People shut down when they don't want to hear, because change is so difficult, and you have to break down everything about yourself and then rebuild yourself, and that's hard for people to do. So it is about having closure. For us as Black people, it's about having closure. And for the other side, for the people that have got the terrible history and they don't want to face it, it's about how to do that with you know, for them to be able to listen. So think about how we do that.
Roger, I didn't know whether you wanted to comment.
Yeah, just real quick. I don't think that it's any accident that we are having this attack on so-called wokeness, at the same time as we're seeing, certainly I see, a rise in anti-Black racism at the moment. I don't think there's any kind of coincidence that that's happening. And all I would say is really what I said before. I just think we have to understand what's going on, and we have to, you know, build the movement that's going to make sure people are fired up, understand, and will fight for what is rightfully ours. You know, reparations, Donna said this before, reparations is not something new. It's something that has a history that has been done for lots of countries and lots of peoples before. They are choosing not to give us the money. They have made that choice. And the only way we turn that choice over is by organizing. That's what it comes down to in the end.
And using the right instruments to do that. There are certain things that we can look at and examine. We just have to tread carefully. Think that we have to use the tools, the Human Rights Act, all of these things. We have to tread carefully, because there are organisations that are taking the governments to task. They're out there, and it's how they're doing it. And they were doing it in 2020. I'll have to check and see how they are progressing with that, and how far they're you know, how far they've got.
But we've got
a long time.
No, sorry, I know Sean's trying to get in, but just if I could just make this one quick point, Anjona. Basically boils down to power, right? All of this boils down to power, who has it and how they're prepared to use it.
Yeah.
And at the moment, we haven't got enough power because we're not organised, and that's what we need to look at.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And we've got Sean wanting to come in. Sean, do you want to unmute and make a contribution, please? And after that, we'll hear from our speakers again, and we'll probably go to a close after that. Thank you. Sean. We can't hear you, Sean. I don't know whether your mic is working. I don't know. Maybe you could make your contribution through the chat if your mic isn't working, if that's okay. I'm really sorry, we can't hear you.
Okay. Can you still hear me?
That's it. That's great. Please go ahead.
Oh, okay, awesome. Thank you. I just wanted to quickly make two quick comments. Firstly, I wanted to say thank you to the panelists for some of the incredible insights that we've actually gleaned from their contributions. So I just wanted to pick up on two things that Roger and Donna said, and some of the latter speakers, in terms of how history has been sanitized to make the colonizers look good, and how we need to understand the importance of being aware of what is actually going on. And there's something that Lucy and Indigo actually touched on in terms of education. So what I wanted to add is, yes, education is important, but I also wanted to add that what is more critical is a form of decolonized kind of education. That is very important to distinguish from just education, because one of the things when we look at what is going on, for example, in places like the US, where we have this massive pushback against the teaching of critical race theory. So that's where some of Roger's contributions can actually be imported in terms of us being aware of what is actually going on. And this pushback against critical race theory is part of not enabling us to exactly do what Roger was saying in terms of truth telling. So that is one of the ways in which they are bearing the truth, bearing in terms of what actually happened in history. And it's very important for us to be aware of the importance of decolonized education, because of the kind of colonized education that we currently have, that is why we get comments, especially from white people, that say slavery is something that was so long ago. Apartheid here in South Africa is something that's in the past, but then they don't understand how the history of our various countries have actually shaped and continue to shape our contemporary societies. So that's the importance of decolonized education. And then just quickly to touch on specifically the topic that we're talking about today, which is reparations. I just wanted to provide a bit of nuance in terms of that kind of debate. And, you know, one is left clueless in terms of why there's this pushback against reparations. And when you actually look at it, for me, it's quite something that is sort of like a given, but then at the same time, there's a problem that I have with the reparations. And that is because when you look at how in some of the countries reparations have actually been paid, one needs to ask, where does the money actually come from? And once you unpack that, you realize that it's the governments that actually pay the money. But then once you look at governments, you know that governments do not have money. They only get money through us, the taxpayers. So in other words, it is basically us paying ourselves through the money that we pay via taxes. So that's a bit of a problem that I have with reparations, but it doesn't mean that we should scrape the whole idea. I think reparations are actually the way to go. And I just wanted to highlight the importance of a decolonized kind of education, where we as people of color and Black people can actually be reflected in the curriculum that is actually being taught in schools, and not the sanitized kind of version that most of us are actually fed and actually led to believe that colonization was something that was good. Like Roger was saying, in terms of how we were told that we were brought infrastructure, we were brought railways and all of these things, but then they failed to mention all of the things that they actually took away in terms of the destruction of families, in terms of the trampling on the dignity of Black people and people of color, and all the various lost opportunities that were taken away. So I think those were just some of the insights that I wanted to share. But thank you so much to all of the panelists for such an amazing discussion and engagement. Thoroughly enjoying it.
Thank you to Sean. Thank you for your contribution. I don't know whether either Donna or Roger want to come back on that. Donna, you're on mute.
Yes, I just wanted to just quickly listen into what Sean was just saying, and just to recap on with things around reparation and compensation, because compensation is about the monetary side of things, about compensating for the loss that we suffered as a nation through all our resources being stolen, our lives being stolen, the abuse and everything that we suffered. And then reparations, that's about the whole healing process. That's about restoration. That's about rehabilitation. That's about all of that, making things right, and re-education. So that's what, those are the main things, the distinctions between reparation and compensation. So compensation's about the money, reparations about restoration, repair, and re-education, basically. So I just wanted to just make that distinction.
Thank you so much, Donna. I don't know whether you wanted to come back in, Roger, at all.
Just for my closing remarks, if I can, Anjona, because and all I would say really quickly as a closing remark is, you know, I mean, it's okay on the one level, us meeting and having a really good meeting like we've done this evening. Thanks ever so much for inviting me, and thanks ever so much everybody for coming along this evening. But it's not enough on its own, simply not enough. If we're really serious about having discussions about reparations, then we have to turn that into action. We have to turn that into doing something to win reparations, because they will not simply just turn around and give us those reparations, as we've learned over the many, many, many years that people have been calling for reparations. So my final word, Anjona, is this. Nobody's going to do this for us. As the great writer, activist, poet June Jordan once said, we are the ones that we've been waiting for. We have to be the ones to go out and organise and make this happen. Thanks ever so much, and thanks ever so much for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure to be with you this evening.
Thank you, Roger, and I just wanted to take the opportunity to ask our audience to give a little bit of love up for all of our contributors, Sharon, Donna, and Roger today. And also, I'm going to say this, if you want to get a good analysis around what's going on in the world today, buy the Morning Star tomorrow, and Roger will be in there. That's all good. Also, just to remind you, this is an event brought to you by Northamptonshire Rights and Equality Council. We're a free discrimination and immigration advice charity. Our next event is going to be an event focusing on rights during immigration raids, and that's on the 26th of September. If you like what we do, please follow us on the socials, join our organisation, and again, a hell of a lot of love and a lot of appreciation to Roger, Sharon, and Donna, and we'll be downloading this and uploading this onto our YouTube channel. If you've enjoyed this, please we'll get in touch with you once the link is available. We'll email you on Eventbrite, and please let other people know. In terms of the socials, we're at Northampton REC on Twitter, at Northamptonshire REC on Instagram, and on Facebook, www.facebook.com/Northampton REC. So thank you so much, everyone, and thank you for the offers of support in the messages too. And thank you and goodbye. And I hope you, again, amazing thank you to our panelists.
Good.